Have you ever heard of a battle where an army was trapped inside its own fortress while an even larger force tried to rescue it, only to find out that they too were trapped? Welcome to the Siege of Alesia, where Julius Caesar turned an apparently impossible war into a masterclass of strategy and patience. If you think that winning a battle means having more soldiers or simply attacking with brute force, maybe it's time to rethink everything you know about war. In this epic showdown, Caesar not only faced one of Gaul's most charismatic leaders, Vercingetorix, but also played chess with geography itself and the minds of his enemies. It wasn't an ordinary victory, it was a stroke of genius. While the Gauls expected a traditional clash, Caesar was busy building walls, not just to stop Vercingetorix from escaping, but to ensure that any rescue attempt would turn into a catastrophe. Who could have imagined that the greatest weapon in this battle wouldn't be swords, but time and hunger? Believe it or not, this battle wasn't just a war of attrition, it was the turning point that sealed the fate of Gaul and catapulted Caesar toward absolute power in Rome. The Roman Empire didn't even exist yet, but it was right here, in front of the walls of Alesia, that it began to take shape. The question is, how did a siege manage to change history so decisively? How was one man able to defeat two armies at once and emerge as the greatest commander of his generation? If you think you've seen epic battles before, wait until you grasp the details of this siege. Strategy, betrayal, hunger, glory, and a final twist straight out of a Roman tragedy. And at the center of it all, Caesar, the soldier who refused to lose. Get ready, because what happened at Alesia wasn't just a war. It was proof that in history, intelligence always trumps brute force. But before we get to the outcome of this battle, it's important to understand how it all began. And believe me, everything was far more calculated than it seems. Rome was an unrelenting machine of expansion, and Julius Caesar had one clear mission: conquer Gaul and consolidate his influence within the Roman Republic. But the Gauls were not a people to give up easily. Amidst divided tribes and internal disputes, a leader emerged who managed to unite much of this resistance under one banner: Vercingetorix, a name that still echoes through history as a symbol of bravery and defiance against Roman rule. The clash between these two titans wasn't just a military battle. It was the collision of two worlds, two styles of warfare, and two forms of government. What led to this epic confrontation? Caesar had already decimated several tribes, won strategic battles, and made it clear that he wouldn't tolerate any resistance, yet the Gauls still held on to hope. Driven by the promise of freedom and the belief that they knew their own lands best, they decided to band together against the Roman army. And Vercingetorix was the man to lead that fight. He understood the raw strength of the Roman soldiers, and for that reason adopted different tactics: scorched earth, lightning attacks, ambushes. He turned war into a game of patience and strategy. But Caesar was no ordinary general. He saw every obstacle as an opportunity to showcase his military genius. The war in Gaul wasn't just about winning on the battlefield. It was also about solidifying his political standing within the Roman Republic. His enemies in Rome wanted to discredit him, and each triumph in Gaul was a blow against his rivals. The Siege of Alesia would become the definitive proof of his capability. Losing meant dishonor, but winning would not only secure dominance over Gaul, but also pave the way for an even more ambitious future. And so, Vercingetorix made his decision: retreat to Alesia, a naturally fortified stronghold, and lure the Romans into a siege. The logic was simple: the Gauls had allies, and reinforcements were bound to come. It was a dangerous gamble, but if it worked, it could turn the tables on Caesar. However, what the Gauls underestimated was the sharp mind of their adversary. Caesar didn't play a game of chance. He built his own luck, stone by stone, wall by wall. When the Romans arrived at the hills of Alesia, the war took on a new form. It was no longer just about spears and shields, but about hunger, time, and psychology. Vercingetorix believed his fortress was impregnable, but Caesar was about to prove that no wall was high enough to deter the will of Rome. And so began one of the most brilliant sieges in military history. But was Vercingetorix really as safe as he thought inside Alesia? Alesia wasn't just any town. Perched atop a towering hill, surrounded by deep valleys and steep slopes, it was the very definition of an impregnable fortress. For Vercingetorix, it was the perfect refuge. From there, he could withstand the Roman siege, waiting for Gaulish reinforcements while wearing down the enemy. The position was excellent. The Roman soldiers would have to contend with difficult terrain, while the defenders could fire from above, taking full advantage of the geography. And let's be honest, if even a general like Caesar hesitated before attacking such a place, it had to be a formidable challenge. But Vercingetorix wasn't relying solely on location. He further reinforced the city's defenses by erecting barricades and expanding the walls. Every entrance was a potential weak spot, so he made sure everything was well protected. Inside Alesia, the Gaulish warriors believed they could hold out long enough for their allies to come to their rescue. After all, they had seen Roman armies suffer in previous sieges. If the Romans struggled to conquer smaller fortresses, imagine one as mighty as Alesia. However, there was one detail that few considered. Caesar didn't need to take Alesia by force. He wasn't an impulsive commander who just threw his legions against walls, hoping brute strength would do the trick. On the contrary, he was a patient strategist, meticulous in his planning, someone who preferred to defeat his enemy before even launching the first strike. And for that, he had a plan. A plan that would turn that safe hill into a death trap. Inside the fortress, the Gauls believed they were secure. The walls were high, the gates sturdy, the archers well positioned. But what if the real enemy wasn't just outside, but within the very walls? After all, war isn't fought solely with swords and spears. It's also fought with time, supplies, and the morale of the troops. And Caesar was about to turn all of that into weapons against the defenders themselves. As Vercingetorix and his men prepared to endure the siege, Caesar and his legions were about to do something few generals would dare. Rome's answer to an impregnable fortress. Simple. Instead of tearing it down, they would ensure no one could escape. And when the supplies started to run out, well, history has already shown what happens when a starving army finds itself cornered. But how exactly did Caesar plan to execute this? If Vercingetorix believed that Alesia was a prison for the Romans, he was about to realize that in truth, the city was a trap for the Gauls themselves. Caesar didn't attack. Instead, he ordered his soldiers to grab their shovels, not their swords. In just a few days, a wall began to rise around the fortress. First, an immense ring of fortifications, the circumvallation, preventing any attempt by the Gauls to escape. Then, another wall, even more impressive, the contravallation, built facing outward to shield the Romans from any enemy reinforcements. It was a siege within a siege. This masterpiece of military engineering spanned more than 16 kilometers. A true necklace of fortifications that strangled Alesia without shedding a single drop of blood. Watchtowers, deep ditches, lethal traps, every detail was crafted to ensure that no one could enter or exit. The Roman soldiers, experienced and disciplined, worked tirelessly, knowing that this was Caesar's game. Patience, control, and an ever-tightening grip on the trapped Gauls. After all, time was on Rome's side. Meanwhile, inside Alesia, Vercingetorix's confidence was starting to give way to concern. Days passed, and the gates remained locked. Messengers were sent out in search of reinforcements, but they had to cross the Roman defenses, which was practically a death sentence. The Gaulish warriors, who once believed they were safe, began to face the harsh reality. The siege wasn't just a blockade, it was a methodical stranglehold. And the longer time went by, the harder it became to survive. Outside the fortress, Caesar's soldiers had everything they needed. The Roman Republic ensured a steady flow of supplies, and his troops, accustomed to long campaigns, were ready to endure for months if necessary. Unlike the Gauls, who could only rely on what was inside their walls, the Romans knew that victory was only a matter of time. As Alesia slowly crumbled under pressure, the legionaries stood firm, watching their enemies wither under the weight of their own despair. But Vercingetorix was not the type of leader to give up easily. He knew he needed an exit, and that exit had to come from outside. The Gauls' only hope now was the arrival of a massive reinforcement, a force capable of breaking through Caesar's walls and freeing the fortress before it was too late. What he didn't know was that Caesar was already expecting that and had prepared his defenses for the worst. When the reinforcements finally arrived, the real battle was just beginning. Inside Alesia, time was running out and food supplies were dwindling. At first, Vercingetorix managed to keep morale high. After all, reinforcements were coming, but days turned into weeks, and the reality grew brutal. With no new supplies coming in, every meal became a challenge, and despair clouded the eyes of the warriors. Hunger didn't strike all at once. It crept in like a stealthy enemy, gnawing away at strength and determination. And Caesar knew this better than anyone. He didn't need to attack, he simply waited. While the Gauls were scrimping on crumbs, the Romans were well stocked. The legions, meticulously organized, received provisions from the Roman Republic with ease. They were there to hold out as long as necessary. Inside Alesia, the scene was very different. Horses were being slaughtered, bread turned into a luxury, and fear spread among the men. How do you fight Rome when your very body can no longer keep up? How do you face well-fed soldiers when you're weak and malnourished? Hunger affected not only the warriors, but also the civilians. Women, children, and the elderly who had followed the fighters into the fortress became an unbearable burden. The cruel but inevitable solution soon came. Vercingetorix ordered the civilians to be expelled from the city, hoping that the Romans would let them pass. But Caesar wasn't falling for that trick. The Romans simply closed their lines and watched. The helpless were caught between two armies with nowhere to go. Neither accepted by the Gauls nor spared by the Romans, they starved to death in front of the very walls that once protected them. Caesar's strategy wasn't just effective, it was psychological. With each passing day, the Gaulish soldiers watched their comrades fall, and the notion of defeat seeped into their minds. Hunger was no longer just a physical problem, but a heavy blow to morale. The big question now was, how much longer could they hold out? Faith in reinforcements still existed, but for how long would it last? Vercingetorix began to realize that the siege was not merely about soldiers and walls, but about patience and despair. Then, when the situation inside the fortress seemed unbearable, a new glimmer of hope appeared on the horizon. The hills around began to fill with warriors. A sea of Gaulish soldiers was approaching. The long-awaited reinforcement had finally arrived. For the men trapped in Alesia, this was their last chance. But would they be able to break through Caesar's iron ring? The horizon filled with dust. It was the sign that something monumental was coming. From atop the walls of Alesia, the Gauls saw what they had been waiting for, a colossal army marching in their direction. Over 100,000 warriors, a force that on paper should have been more than enough to shatter Caesar's defenses. Cries of hope echoed within the fortress. Vercingetorix and his men knew they were still in the game. But to turn that hope into victory, that army had to do the impossible, break through the Roman fortifications. Yet Caesar had anticipated this arrival. He didn't build just any walls. he created a perfect trap. The outer ring of fortifications, the contravallation, was designed precisely for that purpose, to stop any reinforcements from coming through. The Gauls attacked with all their fury, sending waves of warriors against the Roman trenches, trying to carve a path for the besieged. But the Roman soldiers were disciplined, organized, and ready. Every charge was repelled, every attempt at a breakthrough met with steadfast spears and shields. The siege would not yield. Meanwhile, inside Alesia, Vercingetorix observed it all. He knew he couldn't stand idle, so he coordinated an internal attack. His troops burst out of the gates and attacked from the other side, trying to pressure the Romans from the inside out. It was a desperate move, a synchronized assault that depended on the precision of the external reinforcements. But the plan failed. Caesar's defenses were simply impenetrable. The Gauls ran into a wall of iron and discipline, unable to carve out any breaches. Despair set in. The reinforcement army, unable to breach the walls, began to hesitate. For days they tried different attacks, probing for any weakness they could exploit. But time marched on, and hunger continued to ravage the besieged. The great offensive that was supposed to change the tide was turning into a series of failures. Caesar knew that if he could just hold on a little longer, the psychological toll would do its work. Soon, the reinforcements would realize that continuing was futile, and then the worst happened for the Gauls. The reinforcement army, unable to break through the defenses, began to disperse. One by one, the warriors abandoned the fight. What had started as a triumphant march ended in a silent retreat. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix saw his last hope vanish. What was left for him and his men now? The answer was as bitter as it was inevitable. But before the final end, one last battle remained, a battle where Caesar once again would take the lead. The Gauls had no more options. The reinforcements were fleeing. Hunger was gnawing at every warrior inside Alesia, and the only choice left was one final desperate attack. Vercingetorix knew that if he continued waiting, defeat was certain. So, at dawn on a new day, he ordered an all-or-nothing move. The fortress gates swung open, and the Gaulish warriors surged out for one final assault against the Roman defenses. Outside, the last of the remaining reinforcements also launched a final charge. It was a siege exploding on all fronts, a storm of spears and cries. The Roman line began to give way. One of the most critical points in the fortifications was pressured with all its might. The legionaries fought fiercely, but the Gaulish wave was overwhelming. Titus Labienus, one of Caesar's most trusted generals, realized that the situation was becoming perilous. If that sector broke, the entire army could crumble. Commanding the reserves, Labienus launched a brutal counterattack, yet the battle was far from over. Rome was facing its most delicate moment in the siege. It was then that Caesar decided to act personally. Mounted on his horse, wearing his scarlet cloak so that everyone on the battlefield could recognize him, he gathered his elite troops and marched to the center of the fight. With impressive precision, Caesar led his cavalry against the Gauls, striking exactly where the enemy was most vulnerable. The impact was devastating. The momentum of Vercingetorix's warriors was shattered, and one by one, they began to fall or retreat. The leader of the Roman Republic had done what he did best, turned chaos into victory. The Gaulish resistance crumbled before the eyes of their own warriors. The reinforcement army, already weakened and demoralized, witnessed the devastation and lost any remaining shred of hope. The final battle, which should have signified the rebirth of Gaul, became the last gasp of its resistance. Caesar's forces, now in absolute control of the field, hunted down the remaining fighters and sealed the fate of the siege. Alesia was, without a doubt, lost. As the dust settled, silence fell over the battlefield. What remained was no longer an army, but a group of exhausted, defeated survivors within the walls. Vercingetorix, who had once been the hope of all Gaul, now faced the hardest decision of his life. The fate of the Gauls was sealed, but what would be the outcome for the leader who defied Rome? Inside Alesia, silence reigned. The Gaulish army was finished, supplies had run out, and the last hope had fled along with the defeated reinforcements. Vercingetorix, the leader who had united the tribes against Rome, now faced the inescapable reality. The fight was over, but he did not run, nor did he try to escape. Instead, he made a decision that would etch his name in history. He donned his finest armor, mounted his horse, and, before the Roman soldiers, handed his sword over to Julius Caesar. An act that was both one of defeat and of honor. The Romans showed no mercy. Vercingetorix was taken prisoner and paraded through Rome as a living trophy. For 6 years he remained incarcerated, awaiting the day his life would end. And that day came in 46 BC, during Caesar's triumph, when he was dragged through the city's streets before being strangled in a dark cell. Rome had no room for enemies who once challenged its supremacy. Thus, the last great leader of Gaulish resistance met his end, not on the battlefield, but in the dungeons of the Roman Republic. The siege of Alesia wasn't just another military victory. It was the definitive moment that established Caesar as the greatest general of his time. He didn't just win the war in Gaul, he transformed it into a Roman province. Tribes that had once resisted were now under Roman control, and the dream of an independent Gaul was crushed. But for Caesar, this victory meant something even greater: absolute power. The Roman Senate knew he was no longer just a victorious commander. He was a man who had done the impossible, a leader who could not be ignored. And it was precisely this meteoric rise that began to seal Caesar's fate within the Republic itself. His enemies in Rome saw him as a threat, a man who conquered so much and amassed so much power was a danger to the very order of the Republic. The victory at Alesia not only defined the history of Gaul, it set Caesar on the path that a few years later would lead him to cross the Rubicon and to the eventual collapse of the Republic. Yet history has its own sense of irony. Just as Vercingetorix was taken to Rome as a prisoner and executed after his greatest battle, Caesar himself, who emerged as the great victor, would eventually be assassinated in the heart of the city he had so glorified. The Roman Republic was dying, and the Roman Empire was on the horizon. But before that, one final lesson remained to be learned from Alesia. What truly defines victory? Strength or patience? Now you know how Julius Caesar turned a siege into a military masterpiece and paved his way to the top of Rome. But the question remains, what if you were in his shoes? Would you have had the patience to let hunger defeat your enemies? Or would you have tried to solve everything with brute force, like so many other generals before you? In the end, the great lesson of Alesia isn't just about war, it's about life. Winning isn't always about attacking. Sometimes it's about building your own walls and waiting for the right moment. And Vercingetorix, he wasn't just any warrior. He united tribes, defied the greatest military power of his time, and even in defeat, he went down in history. But in the game of strategy, wanting to win isn't enough. It's about knowing how to win. How many times have you felt surrounded by problems, waiting for a reinforcement that never came? Perhaps the answer isn't in asking for help, but in changing your approach. Rome wasn't built with just swords, but with tactics, vision, and control. And if there's one lesson here, it's that planning and patience beat chaos and brute force. What can you take from this knowledge into your own life? Are you playing chess or merely reacting to the daily attacks? Had Caesar despaired, he would have lost. Had the Gauls thought ahead, perhaps Rome wouldn't have emerged victorious. In the end, it's not the strongest who survive, but the most strategic. So now I ask you, what siege are you facing today? How can you use this mindset to conquer your own battles? If you want to keep learning about these hidden lessons in history, subscribe to the channel and hit the notifications. After all, Rome wasn't built in a day, and the knowledge that makes you unbeatable won't come overnight. Let's embark on this journey together.